Sam stood at the fellowship podium, his voice carrying through the packed campus hall with familiar confidence. As TCN's fellowship leader, he had earned respect through his unwavering dedication and genuine concern for others' spiritual growth. Students would often seek his counsel, drawn to his warm smile and steadfast faith. That was before Nancy walked into their Thursday evening meeting. She sat in the back row, her curious eyes meeting his as he spoke about staying focused on one's spiritual journey. Something about her presence made him stumble over his usually fluid delivery. After the service, she approached him with questions that seemed sincere, if somewhat challenging. "I'm interested in faith," she said, "but I have so many doubts. Could we talk about them sometime?" Sam saw it as an opportunity for ministry, a chance to guide another soul toward the light. He agreed to meet her at the campus cafe the following week. One meeting turned into 2, then 3, and soon they were having regular discussions that stretched far beyond matters of faith. Nancy was different from the other fellowship members. She asked questions that made him think, challenged his perspectives, and showed him sides of life he'd kept carefully walled off. Her laughter was infectious, her mind sharp, and her presence increasingly distracting. He found himself looking forward to their meetings more than fellowship planning sessions. During prayer meetings, his thoughts would drift to their conversations. He began spending less time preparing his sermons and more time thinking about what to wear when they met. The change in Sam didn't go unnoticed. His assistant leaders exchanged worried glances when he started showing up late to executive meetings. The passionate prayers he once led became shorter, more perfunctory. But it was the way he looked at Nancy during services that raised the most concern. There was nothing ministerial about those glances. One evening, as they walked across campus after another long discussion, Nancy stopped and turned to him. The setting sun cast a golden glow across her face, and Sam felt his heart race. "You know," she said softly, "I'm not really interested in joining the fellowship. I just wanted to spend time with you." The words hit him like a bucket of cold water, but instead of stepping back as he knew he should, he found himself drawing closer. The boundaries he'd set for himself as a leader, the principles he'd preached about maintaining spiritual focus, they all seemed to fade in the warmth of her presence. That night, alone in his room, Sam stared at his reflection in the mirror. The fellowship leader's badge on his desk seemed to mock him. How had he let himself stray so far from his calling? The young man who had once burned with spiritual fervor now burned with a different kind of fire, one that threatened to consume everything he'd built. His phone buzzed with a message from Nancy, and his hand trembled as he reached for it. In that moment, Sam realized he stood at a crossroads. The path ahead would either lead to redemption or further into the wilderness of his desires. The choice, as it had always been, was his to make. His phone buzzed with a message from Nancy. "Sam, I need to talk to you. Something's really bothering me. Can I come over to your place? I need someone I can trust." Sam stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. A voice in his head warned him about the impropriety of having her visit his apartment alone. But another voice, growing louder by the day, insisted he could handle any situation. After all, wasn't he still a spiritual leader? Hadn't he counseled countless students before? "I should be strong enough to handle this," he muttered to himself as he typed his response. "Come over at 7. The knock on his door came precisely at 7. Nancy stood there in a red outfit that made Sam immediately question his decision. Her eyes were already glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you for letting me come," she said, stepping inside. "I didn't know who else to turn to." They sat on the living room couch, maintaining what Sam thought was a safe distance. Nancy began to speak, her voice trembling. "I've been having these dreams," she said, wringing her hands. "They're disturbing. In them, there's this man." Her voice broke and tears began rolling down her cheeks. Sam's pastoral instincts kicked in, momentarily overwhelming his better judgment. "It's okay," he said, moving closer to comfort her. "You can tell me." Nancy leaned into him, her head coming to rest against his chest. The scent of her perfume clouded his thoughts. His heart raced as she continued speaking, but he barely heard the words. In that moment, Sam realized he had severely overestimated his strength and underestimated his weakness. Their closeness felt both wrong and intoxicating. As Nancy's tears soaked into his shirt, Sam's mind flashed to all the times he'd warned others about putting themselves in compromising situations. He had always been so certain of his spiritual fortitude, so confident in his ability to resist temptation. Now, sitting there with Nancy in his arms, those certainties crumbled. His phone buzzed again, a message from one of the fellowship leaders about tomorrow's meeting. The sound cut through the moment like a knife, reminding him of who he was supposed to be, of the trust others had placed in him. Sam knew he stood at the edge of a precipice, and his next action would determine everything that followed. "Everything will be fine," Sam said hastily, his voice catching in his throat. "Let me pray with you about this." But before he could step back, Nancy wrapped her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for letting me share this burden with you." Her grip tightened, and Sam found himself frozen, caught between his role as a spiritual counselor and the electric feeling coursing through his veins. That night, Sam knelt beside his bed, as he always did for his evening prayers. But for the first time in years, words failed him. His usual eloquent prayers dissolved into distracted mumbles. Every time he closed his eyes, he could smell the lingering scent of Nancy's perfume on his shirt, which he hadn't brought himself to change. The notification sound from his phone broke through his attempted prayers. Nancy had sent him a friend request on Facebook. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before accepting it. Soon he found himself scrolling through her profile, downloading her photos, each click feeling like another brick being added to a wall between him and his calling. In one photo, she was smiling at sunset, the same way she had looked at him earlier. In another, she was at a beach, her face radiant with joy. With each image he saved, Sam felt himself sinking deeper into a pit of desire he had once preached against. The same fingers that had lifted in praise now trembled as they touched his phone screen, saving picture after picture. The clock on his wall showed 2 a.m., but sleep eluded him. His Bible lay unopened on his nightstand while his phone glowed with Nancy's images. The young man who had once led powerful all-night prayer sessions now spent his darkness hours fighting and failing to control his thoughts. He tried to rationalize his actions. He was just being pastoral, showing concern for a troubled soul. But even as he formed these excuses, he knew they were lies. The fellowship leader who had once helped others overcome their struggles was now losing his own battle, one saved photo at a time. In the quiet of his room, illuminated only by his phone screen, Sam barely recognized himself anymore. The line between spiritual counseling and personal desire had blurred beyond recognition, and he was too entangled to see a way back. The following weeks marked a steep descent in Sam's spiritual life. His once powerful sermons became hollow echoes of their former selves. During fellowship meetings, his eyes would constantly drift to where Nancy sat, watching as she took notes with seemingly innocent attention. She'd started attending regularly now, but not for the reasons he had originally hoped. Their text conversations grew longer and more frequent. What started as spiritual counseling evolved into late-night chats about everything and nothing. Sam found himself sending good morning messages before his daily devotion, which itself had dwindled to merely skimming a few verses. The Fellowship Executive Committee noticed the change. Sister Mary, his assistant leader, confronted him after a particularly distracted prayer meeting. "Sam, what's happening to you?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Your prayers, they're different. You're different." He dismissed her concerns with a practiced smile and some vague explanation about being tired from his studies. But her words haunted him because they were true. The fire that once burned for ministry had been replaced by a different kind of flame, one that consumed rather than illuminated. Nancy seemed to sense her growing power over him. Her texts became more suggestive, her outfits more distracting during fellowship meetings. She would deliberately seek his counsel after services, often being the last to leave, creating moments of dangerous solitude. One evening, as Sam was locking up the fellowship hall, Nancy approached him again. "I had another dream," she whispered, standing closer than necessary. "But this time, the man in my dream, he was you, Sam." The keys nearly fell from his trembling hands. The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. The same hands that had lifted in worship now reached for Nancy's, his pastoral role completely forgotten. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the Campus Christian Council. "Emergency meeting tomorrow. Topic: reports of inappropriate relationship between fellowship leaders and members." Sam's world froze. Had someone noticed? Had they been watching? The phone felt heavy in his hand, like the weight of his compromised integrity pressing down on him. In that moment, standing in the darkened fellowship hall with Nancy's hand in his, Sam finally saw clearly what he had become and the price he would have to pay for his choices.